I think struggling with matters of loneliness is way more common than people actually care to admit. And it's crazy because loneliness is rarely ever about being like a hermit in a cabin and you're all alone. Honestly, for most of us, it's more about just floating through your life. You know, you probably have acquaintances, you have people you talk to at work or school or wherever you go. And maybe you have like a friend group that maybe you hop on Discord with, but you're floating on the outside of it. You're like on the outside of a bubble. You know, you're the guy who gets the invite, but maybe you aren't the one people call when they actually have something to talk about. Loneliness comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. More than likely, if you're feeling lonely, you probably feel like you're somewhere in the gap between having people to hang out with and having a group or a relationship that actually matters. You know, more than likely, if you're feeling lonely, maybe you feel like you're a background character in somebody else's life. And I really wanted to get into this topic because I spent a decent amount of time in my life in that exact same situation, in that exact same gap. You know, I went from being one half of a really well-known duo in high school to having almost zero friend group infrastructure. You know, I wasn't only feeling lonely in that situation, I was actually isolated completely. So yeah, I want to talk about all that. I want to talk about how that happened and the physical toll that it took and how I had to kind of rebuild myself from scratch. So yeah, when I was in high school, I genuinely feel like I had it made. You know, I was part of a duo. We were a package deal. You know, I considered him to be my best friend. And if you were friends with him, you were friends with me. That's kind of how it worked. You know, it was super comfortable. It was a really good, healthy dynamic. But about midway through high school, he started to drift from me a bit. You know, he started to hang out with a rougher crowd, people who were into drugs. He started doing drugs himself. He eventually ended up becoming a drug dealer behind everybody's back. And, you know, I didn't want any part of that world. That just wasn't something that I identified with, and I stayed behind. I shrugged my shoulders and I said, you know what? I'm not getting invited to these parties that he's going to. And honestly, I don't even really want to. And sadly, a lot of people that were also mutual friends, so some, you know, tangential friends I had, other close friends, they decided to stay friends with him. They decided to stay really close with him. And that was really, really isolating. You know, at that point when he left, I realized I was genuinely socially bankrupt. You know, I spent all my time as, I guess, half of a duo or a piece of that pie. I hadn't really built super strong individual connections with other people. You know, I knew people knew me, like I had good dynamics, but I didn't have a standing with much other people. You know, we were friends, but me and him, like it was really just a strong bond. And it was also a friendship of convenience too. But you know, that type of standing where you know people and they know you, but you're not super close with them and you're an acquaintance to everybody, this is the floating that I'm talking about. You're floating through life. You're floating through relationships. You're floating through friendships. You're close enough to talk to people, but you're not close enough to reach them. You know, if you're lonely right now in this situation and you're watching this video, it's likely because you haven't built out your own social infrastructure. You know, maybe you're relying on one person or one entity or one idea or one specific setting like school or a job or whatever to provide you, you know, your people, to give you a conveyor belt of friends. And when that setting or that person or that situation disappears, you could be left with nothing. You know, it's a realization you have to come to, and, you know, that realization really hit me because this one person dropped off the face of the earth and went to go do drugs, and I was left kind of alone. And coming to that realization and spending that time alone, it started off with a bang. Like, I'd come home from school, and I would just be depressed. I would just be run down. I would just be sad. I'd just lay there in my bed for hours. I would maybe take a nap, go on my phone, but just do nothing. And I was pretty driven at that point in my life. I was uploading YouTube videos every single week. You know, I was trying to get into working out, but everything just kind of fizzled. I had interests, but I didn't really care about them. And it was really sad because I just felt like the life was being drained from me because I was thinking like, oh, you know, like, oh, back in the day, we used to do this, we used to do that. And I'd be reminiscing on a year ago. You know, when you're in high school, it's supposed to be a lot of just optimism and happiness. And I wasted a whole 6-month period just kind of wasting away. And I think one of the key details when people describe loneliness, a key detail that people miss is that loneliness isn't just like a mental state. It's also a physical rot. You know, when you feel like you're not seen by anybody, you stop seeing yourself as something worth maintaining or taking care of or building esteemable acts into. I looked at my phone every 5 minutes, hoping for a text or an invite or a call. I was hoping to get stopped in the hallway for an invite and nothing was there. It's a specific type of pain. And, you're looking at a blank screen of your life and realizing that if you didn't reach out first, your phone would just never ring again. And that's just what it was. And it was such a big difference from the year before. And the genuine hard truth is, the world is busy. Everyone else is caught up in what they have going on or, their own duo or their own group. Nobody's looking for the guy who disappeared into his bedroom. As much as you need somebody to save you, you have to be the one to knock on the door and do it yourself. And the way that I honestly broke out of this loneliness, it wasn't like a sudden explosion of confidence and, oh my God, I'm all cured. It all started with just a walk. I decided that because I was into fitness and I enjoyed lifting, I enjoyed doing cardio, even though I had no idea what I was doing, I decided I was going to walk to the gym every single day. Rain, snow, whatever. And I mean it. There was giant snow mounds that I was climbing over to get to the gym. I needed to get out of that bed in a big, ridiculous way because the bed was where I was slowly wasting away. That walk every single day after school, it was really important to me because it was low stimulus. I didn't have to have a podcast in or, any specific goal that I was going after. I would just listen to music. I would just listen to music and I would walk. It would be 45 minutes total in each day. And, I was forced in that time to just be alone with my thoughts and to process things. And it was very, very therapeutic. I was pretty much forced in that moment, even though I was only 16 years old. I was forced to audit my own life. That's my social life, relationships, everything. I had to face the facts. I was gaining weight because I was depressed because of the friendship thing. I was lonely and, I was kind of 5 out of 10ing everything in my life. And that was just due to my mental state. And during my daily walks, and I mean daily, every single day other than maybe Sunday, and during those walks, I started to meditate on my interests, on my life. I realized I had 2 things I actually cared about, and that was fitness and that was YouTube. I decided that if I couldn't find a group of friends right now, I could at least become a guy who was established in something, and I stopped trying to solve loneliness, and all I did was just lean into things that I like. By the time I'd reached the gym, my head would be significantly clearer. And if it wasn't more clear, it would be more clear when I got home or the next day reflecting on my time at the gym. I wasn't looking for a best friend at the gym or, on YouTube. I was looking for a workout. But something interesting that happens when you stop seeking people specifically and start seeking a goal and a version of yourself you want to be, well, you naturally become the kind of person people want to be around. And that's how you get friends. That's how you get a girlfriend. And then after I was building myself up, when I finally felt ready to start, putting myself out there and to be social again, I wasn't in it to find a best friend. I definitely didn't try to find a girlfriend or anything like that. That's how you get hurt with expectations and you end up laying face flat in your bed again. I focused on seeds. I focused on planting seeds. A seed, in this case, would be an acquaintance who shares one specific functional interest with you. For me, these were, people that I went to school with, whether it was in my, my assorted different classes, gym class, whatever it is, a few people from school, and they knew I liked the same games as them or the same, if they were into YouTube. A lot of people thought the YouTube thing was very cool. In the friend group that I'm actually in right now, I'm 27 years old as of recording this. The friend group I have right now was actually planted the seeds because a bunch of people I went to school with and had classes with thought my YouTube channel was cool. Instead of trying to be friends with these people, I just engaged with them on that one interest. I'd ask a friend in my gym class about his gym split, or I'd talk to my friend in my tech class about a YouTube video that I was editing or a series I was making on my channel. I wasn't asking for their time. I was just sharing more of myself. And in order to share some of yourself, you need to build some of yourself. And I think overall, one of the common factors when it comes to lonely people is they don't think that they are worthy. They don't think they're worthy, and that gets in the way more than anything. If you're watching a self-help video about how to stop being lonely, you're a thoughtful person. You're a deeply thoughtful person, and somebody who's willing to do that type of work for themselves in the background, they are worthy, I assure you. And above all, just know that loneliness is not a permanent state. It's just a sign. It's just a symptom, that your social infrastructure is broken. It needs some work. So stop mourning the old group or the old relationship or the old life and start the progress on the new one. Start your version of the walk today. And I have a little bit of a challenge for you guys. I want you guys to go in the comments right now. If you're struggling with loneliness or if you've ever struggled with loneliness in the past, let me know. Let me know how that was and what you did to pull yourself out of it. I love starting those conversations in the comments, and you never know who reads it. Somebody might need your help. Oh, and also one more thing before I end off here. I just want to say thank you guys so much for all the support on the channel lately. Channel's doing super, super well. We have a lot of growth, and I'm really excited about where we're going to take this thing. I did make a Discord, a community where we can all share our goals, talk to each other, socialize, build a real community. It's linked in the description. Feel free to go join it. I'm chatting in there all the time, so if you guys want to get some one-on-one time, well, that's where it's done.